Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to our class. We're going to conclude with the binding of Isaac today, and then we're going to continue on this same theme of the challenges of faith that God puts before all of us. I want to thank the sponsors for today's class and for today's lunch. Aliza George is sponsoring. This is in honor of her sister who came from Israel. We welcome her. She's here in the back. And for her brother's Yortzeit, Moshe Bryski, his neshama should have an aliyah. Jeff and Lori Goldchen are also sponsoring, and they're sponsoring in honor of my birthday. Yeah, thank you.
You're going to be 41?
I'm going to be 40 years old today.
39 for Jack Benny.
I didn't know you were a year older than Jack Benny.
Yeah. Also want to announce that Purim, the holiday of Purim, is coming up, and we're going to have a wonderful Purim carnival here Sunday, March 24th. Be sure to put the date on your calendar. You have the flyers in front of you, those that are here in the room. Those out in Zoom land, please put the date on your calendar, Sunday, March 24th. Make your reservations in advance. It'll be a wonderful dinner for you and your family here. Go to jewishacademy.com and sign up to join us for Purim. Last week, we went through what I call the dimensions of understanding the binding of Isaac. Because when we read the story, it's obviously a shocking story to all of us, especially when you read it the first time. Why would God ask him to do such a thing? What do we benefit from it? A lot of questions come to mind the very first time you read the story, especially if you don't know the ending, then you're really worried about how is this all going to go down. But as you look deeper into it, you begin to understand that this is a story that needs to be understood on various different levels, and one level upon another level upon another level. For the benefit of those that weren't here last week, I'm going to briefly go over the dimensions that we established last week, and then we're going to go on with the question that I closed last week's class with, and we'll answer that question and go on from there. So the dimensions that I established was dimension number one, was that it went against everything that Abraham preached and represented. Abraham was a busy man the first 100 years of his life. We're now at year 137 of his life. He's worked hard these 137 years primarily as an outreach center to get people to believe in a one God, to get people to believe in goodness, to get people to believe in kindness. This is what he preached, and he brought about many followers that broke away from their past to follow in his teachings and stay away from the idols and stay away from the idea of bringing your firstborn son as an offering to an idol. God doesn't believe in human sacrifice. So everything that he preached and everything that he represented and everything that he revolutionized in the world is what's at stake here. Because when God comes to him and says, now take your son and bring him as an offering, that will go against everything that Abraham in his entire lifetime represented. And certainly at some point it has to enter his mind that at some point he comes back from this journey. And at some point it gets out as to what he did on this journey. How does he face the people? Will there be any people for him to face? Who would want to have anything to do with Abraham? So the first dimension is that this was not just the difficulty of the challenge of faith as we see it, bring your son as an offering. It was a challenge that went against everything that Abraham himself represented. He would be disgraced. He would be made into a mockery. He would be called a hypocrite. Everything you told us, you yourself went against. That was dimension number one. Dimension number two was that in that period of time of godly communication to Abraham, we have chapter after chapter that had very specifics. Specifics meaning you're going to start a new nation. This nation is going to bring blessings to all the families on the face of the earth. This nation is going to live on eternally. They will always be. This nation will be like the stars in heaven, like the sand on the seashore. This nation will inherit the land of Israel. Very specifics. And then after Ishmael is born, he's told it will not be from Ishmael. When Isaac is born, he's told it will be from Isaac. So all of these divine communications that Abraham had in his lifetime are all pointing now on the shoulders of Isaac. Isaac didn't get married yet, as this story comes to us. Isaac has no children. If Isaac is no more, what happened to all of the promises? So that element of confusion has to set in. So I understand what God is asking of me today. What I don't understand is, what about all the communications of yesterday? What about all the communications of the last decade? Of the last 40 years? What do I do with all of that of the last 50 years? That's the second dimension of the difficulty of this challenge. Dimension number 3 was that Isaac, who plays a big part in this story and demonstrates tremendous faith in this story. Faith in his father, by the way, that he doesn't think his father has gone senile. He's stronger than his father. He's a young man. He could easily run away, but he believes. So like Abraham, he has that element of faith. And if this is what God wants, he's prepared to do it. So we don't undermine the faith of Isaac, but at the same time, it doesn't compare to the faith of Abraham. Because Isaac was being asked to die as a Jew, Abraham was asked to live on as a Jew afterwards. He would have to face the people. He would have to face his own wife and tell her what he did. That difficulty of living on afterwards is far more challenging than being able to leave on the mountain and have your soul return to heaven on the mountain and never have to face tomorrow. Sometimes living on is the greater challenge. Dimension number 4 we got into is the personality and the characteristics of Abraham. Each of the patriarchs represented a particular pathway of spirituality and of personal spiritual growth. Abraham's pathway, Abraham's personality, Abraham's characteristics was all about chesed, was all about kindness. So if you're a person of kindness, the most difficult challenges for you would be challenges that oppose kindness, that are not kind in their way, the face value of it. So for someone like Abraham to be asked to do something which is the exact opposite of kindness makes it this greater challenge of him. So each dimension is building as to why this is so difficult. Why is it so difficult? Finally, dimension number 5. In the wording that God chooses to introduce the binding of Isaac challenge to Abraham, he chooses words of love about Isaac. He builds up the love for Isaac. Take your son, your only son, the son that you love, take Isaac. He is demonstrating to Abraham that Isaac is a worthy successor, that Isaac is growing up perfectly, that he's spiritually accepted, not like Ishmael. But I want him. And so Abraham is not given any justification. He's not told, your son is no good. Your son didn't live up to expectations. We're going to have to come up with a new plan. Your son is not a worthy successor to lead the chosen people. He's not told that. He's told, your son is worthy of your love. No reason is given. No justification is given. And we contrasted this with what we had in the Torah test number 9. There were 10 tests of Abraham. And the 10th one is the binding of Isaac. But the one right before the 9th test, which was also considered very difficult for Abraham, yet it's so different than test number 10. And in that one, it's when Sarah tells Abraham, I'm asking you, Abraham, to send Ishmael away. I don't want him and his mother living in the household here together with Isaac. And the Torah tells us, the Torah testifies to us how difficult this was for Abraham. Even though she's presenting a logical reason for the difficulty, as a man of kindness, it's hard for him. As a man who loves his son, it's hard for him. So we know emotionally, Abraham is a kind man and he loves his kids. And he's not being told to slaughter Ishmael. He's being told to tell them to find another home. not permanently, but during the upbringing of Isaac, Ishmael shouldn't live here. And yet, that was very difficult for Abraham, and he couldn't do it. Until God comes to him and God says, listen to your wife. She's right. So now you have logic being presented to him, and you have God endorsing the logic. And then God comes to him and says, and I see that it's difficult for you, so I want to tell you that I, God, will promise him protection. I'll take care of Ishmael. You don't have to worry about him. And yet, it was still difficult for him. Contrast that to here. No logic is given. No promise of protection. No promise of a future. No promise that when you come back, Sarah will be okay with it. No promise that Sarah will yet have another child that will be the father of this new nation. No continuation of the promises. Nothing is given to him. So in the contrast of test number 10 to test number 9, there's no comparison. And finally, dimension number 6. I call it Mesirat Nefesh, the giving of the self. You know, we often have that word Mesirat Nefesh when one gives over of themselves. Here it's the perfection, if I can use that word, the perfection, the epitome of the giving of self. Giving of self doesn't necessarily mean giving of your life. It's the very giving of self. It's everything he was about, everything he represented, everything he believed in, his very inner self. He was being asked to sacrifice. The epitome of self. Can you give that? Can you give the ultimate self over to God? And not only does he do it, but what's stressed is that he does it with alacrity. He does it with passion. There's no hesitation. There's no stalling. There's no but questions. He had many legitimate questions he could have asked God. But what about this? But what about that? Can I go in 3 days' time? Can I spend some time with him before I have to do this? Did he do anything wrong, God? Just let me know. Nothing. God asked, he delivers. To the question we asked at the end of last week's class. It's a question that the Lubavitcher Rebbe, in one of his talks on the subject of the binding of Isaac, he addresses. You know, we discussed the uniqueness of the binding of Isaac, but at the same time, we're students of history. And as students of history, we know that countless numbers of Jews have given their lives over the thousands of years of our history and not renounced their faith. So, what about them? What about their greatness? Now, some may answer that the willingness to sacrifice a child is far greater, as we mentioned, than the sacrifice of yourself. But at the same time, we have found heroes throughout Jewish history that were also called upon to sacrifice their own children, and did so for God. Most famous of the stories is Hannah and her 7 sons that we celebrate around the time of Hanukkah, where her sons were asked to bow to an idol, and they do not. And in front of their mother, she loses 7 of her children, each one being asked to bow to an idol. And finally, Hannah herself gives her life. And before she gives her life, she jumps off a balcony. She yells out, "My children, go to Abraham, your father, and say to him, you bound 1 offering upon the altar. I have bound 7 offerings." Is she not as great as Abraham? Abraham was just asked to do this and didn't have to. She did. Hannah lost 7 children. Hannah's life came to an end. Is she not greater than the story of the binding of Isaac? All of those that gave their lives throughout all of our history, and many of them, by the way, you should know, you're thinking they were the most religious of people. Not necessarily so. In all the periods of time where Jews gave their lives for God, it wasn't necessarily the most religious of people. But to bow, that I won't do. To give up my Jewish pride, that I won't do. And we had that through all of the pogroms of the Jewish people. Simple Jews were willing to give up their lives rather than denounce their Judaism. Sadly, I'm saying this in a week when there was a Academy Awards presentation where someone that was awarded an Academy Award for making a film about the Holocaust publicly before millions of people renounced his Judaism. Sad and tragic. Huh?
The audience applauded.
Yeah. The audience filled with many Jews. That's, but we won't go there today. Maybe another time.
Don't beat me up.
Yeah. The Rebbe further adds the question that unlike Abraham, God never spoke to these people personally. They just did what they felt was right. Here, God spoke to him. He heard God's voice. So again, wouldn't their level of faith, their level of commitment, their level of sacrifice be greater than the story of Abraham? Now, we're not here to make a competition of which one was stronger, but yet we started this class on the binding of Isaac saying that every day in our prayers we repeat this story. And in our prayers we say that Kemosha Kavash Avram Avinu as Racham, of just like what Abraham did and didn't spare his compassion for his son, we ask you, God, to spare us. So we're pointing to the story and we say, and because of this story, bless us, God. Watch over us. Watch over the descendants of Abraham. Why wouldn't we have added many other stories in our prayers? One final question and then we'll get to some of the answers. We understand that why this was the 10th and final test. But would you not say that his first challenge in his life, the first of the 10, was perhaps even greater? The first challenge was with King Nimrod. King Nimrod makes himself into God and wants everyone to bow to him. Young Abraham says, "You're not God. I don't believe you as God. You're not my God. There's a creator of the world." Now at that particular time, Abraham is risking his life. He's being told by Nimrod, if you don't accept me as God, I'm throwing you into a fire. There's a fire burning right there. His life is at stake. And God had not spoken to him once yet. So it's just faith that he happens to believe there's a God, but there's been no communication at this point in his life with God. So would that not be the greater statement of someone who has no relationship with God, has had no communication with God, sees the fire right there, and yet is willing to be thrown into a fire for a God he has never spoken to, never heard about? His father didn't tell him anything about God. His grandfather didn't tell him anything about God. Would that not have been the greater statement of commitment on Abraham's part over the 10th test of the binding of Isaac? Those are the questions. And the Rebbe started his response to all of these questions with a parable. And the parable will help us understand the pathway that we're going to take. And he said, once there was a vast wilderness, and in this vast wilderness, there were no paths, there was no roads, there were no trails, there was no maps, no information about the terrain. And along comes one individual who pioneers the wilderness. And he cuts this pathway through the entire length of the wilderness. Now, since he's done it, many have followed in his footsteps. Many have now taken this pathway through the terrain. And some of their journeys perhaps were even more difficult than the original pioneer. Maybe the weather was worse. Maybe the pioneer did it in daytime and they were doing it at nighttime. Maybe there were more bandits on the way in their particular time. But at least there was a path to follow. There was a map to read. There was a guide as to how to get through the wilderness. Once there is the map, everyone can find a way through it. Will it be difficult? Yes. But at least we have a pioneer. We have a map. We have a pathway. We have a way to go. Abraham was the pioneer of Mesirat Nefesh, of giving oneself completely over to God. All that followed the path afterwards, even those whose conditions were so much worse, as we use the example of Hannah and her 7 sons, but the ability to do this, the strength to do it, the inner strength to do it, the courage to do it, came about because it's in our DNA. And it was planted there by our grandfather Abraham. Because he was the first, he was able to implant it in all of his descendants that came afterwards. So that we have the strength throughout the thousands of years of Jewish history of facing whatever we were going to face. And to have the strength to come through it. And to have the faith to come through it. And to have the betachon to come through it. We wouldn't have had that had there not been this pioneer. In effect, it's Abraham's Mesirat Nefesh. That in itself is being repeated every time a Jew steps up and is willing to give their very life for God or for Judaism or for Torah. It's really Abraham doing it again. Because it's finding the Abraham DNA within us and finding that strength that we're tuning into and using our grandfather Abraham's strength to get through whatever we're going through. Second, the binding of Isaac was uniquely different than the challenge of the fire when Abraham was young in front of King Nimrod. And many of the other challenges of self-sacrifice that came thereafter. There are people of all faiths that come to a conclusion that life is not worth living unless, and fill in the space. Every religion will have different things that it's more important than life itself. There are people till this day that give their very lives for causes that they believe in. People that burn themselves in public square to protest certain things they see going on and give their very lives. But that is coming through, again, a logical conclusion that life is not worth living unless. You make a calculated decision that this condition is not worth living if I'm forced to do A, B, or C. Perhaps there's a belief in a heavenly world. There's a belief that from here I go to another existence and the other existence is better than this existence. All of that is possible when people give up their lives. But there you're making a decision that there is an existence that's better than this. So really, you're serving self. You're giving up your life, but you're still serving the self. The decision that the self has come to. Either that life is not worth living like this, or that there's a better existence. You're still trying to benefit from your decision. You follow me? You're not sacrificing yourself. You're serving yourself. I'm not taking anything away from it. But the fact is, it's a calculated decision. Let's contrast this to what we have established in our dimensions about the binding of Isaac. Would things be better after this? Would Abraham's popularity of bringing people closer to God benefit from this? Would the existence in the world be any better if this happened? Does Abraham have a logical understanding that life is not worth living if Isaac is apart with us? Nothing matches up. And that's why I build the dimensions with you, is to show you that everything points to the very sacrifice of self. He's giving everything up. Everything he believes in. There's nothing left for him after this. There's nothing to hope for because tomorrow is taken away from him, because all the blessings about the future is on Isaac's shoulders. His marriage is up with Sarah after this. His students are up. His calling is up. Everything is over. And yet, God comes to him and says, this is what I want you to do. So why does he do it? There's only one reason. Because God asked. Nothing else. You can't point to anything in the binding of Isaac and give it a logical explanation as to why would Abraham do it. Anytime that we're challenged and we have the slightest bit of how this could come out better, okay, we're still serving self. I'm not taking away from the challenges, but there's still a dream of tomorrow, of what tomorrow will bring. If I only get through this, then tomorrow will be better. Abraham doesn't have that. He has nothing to hope for the minute this is over. Nothing to look forward to the minute this is over. God asked, and that's the only reason he does it. That's the perfection of how far a human being was ever able to get. I'm not trying to put us in that saying, would we do that? All I'm trying to paint for you is the highest a human being was ever able to get in perfection of doing that which God asked, just because God asked. We have one story like that, and that's the binding of Isaac. Because it's the complete sacrifice of everything. There's nothing left for Abraham. It's the truest self-sacrifice that we have. It doesn't take away anything from Hannah and her 7 sons. It doesn't take away any from the millions of Jews throughout Jewish history that gave their lives for God, who refused to bow, or whatever it may have been, challenges that we've been through. It doesn't take away anything from the holiness of the 6 million. It doesn't take away any of the holiness of every member of the IDF that gives their life for the protection of Israel. They're all great heroes. They're all Kiddush Hashem. They all gave their lives to sanctify God's name. And in fact, in our prayers that we say on Mondays and Thursdays, we do talk about all those throughout history. That gave it all. That gave everything for God. With all the sacrifices that we have made and everything that we have given up, we haven't forgotten our allegiance to God. We haven't rebelled against God. We've kept our faith intact. And that's why at the end of the story of the binding of Isaac in the text of the Torah, there's an interesting word. It says, God sends the angel, stop Abraham from doing it, and tells him that he just tested him, and he never told him to slaughter his son. He said to offer him, and now that you offer him, take him down. And then God says, Ki ata yodaiti, now I know, Ki yirei Elokim ata, that you live with an awe of God. Now you know? Now you know? 137 years you don't know this? Now you know? Ki ata yodaiti, now I know? The prior 9 tests in his life didn't mean anything. Everything that Abraham accomplished didn't mean anything. That you can use the words, now I know. And the answer is, now I know that everything that you've done before was for the purity of it. Not for the self, but for the purity of giving yourself completely over to God. Many have asked the obvious question about all of these challenges of faith. And the reason we're talking about it is because we were discussing that God sometimes puts false prophets in front of us to challenge our faith, to test our faith. So the question when it comes to all of these understandings of God putting these challenges in front of us, in general and in particular with the binding of Isaac, if God knows the future, because God is infinite, therefore God knows the outcome of the challenges that we're going through. Therefore, God knew that Abraham would not withhold his son. If he knows the outcome, why test? Why put him through it? Ata yadaita, you're saying, now I know, but you're God. You knew before. You knew because you knew what the story would unfold. You knew that if you asked him to bring his only son, you were able to see in your future tense that he would do it. So if you are able to see that, why actually put him through it? It's a question in philosophy. Does the knowledge of God, putting the tests in front of us, why put the challenge in front of us if you're God and you're infinite and you know what will be? There are numerous answers given by the commentaries on this fundamental question. And we'll focus on the binding of Isaac, on that particular story to ask this question, and I'll give you 4 answers. Number 1, in the system that God created, the system of the world, the system of free choice, the system of reward and punishment that God created and built into the world, reward is given for action and for deed, not for potential. You're not rewarded because potentially you could have done. You don't get a reward because God knew if he would ask you, you would do A, B, and C. So therefore, let me reward you for it even though you didn't do it. You're given reward for action items, for things that you did in your life. Only after Abraham and Isaac lived through this experience, they actualized it. Not in potential, but in actuality. They walked the walk. They talked the talk. They climbed the mountain. Isaac was bound. The knife was in Abraham's hand. They went the distance. Now they can be rewarded for this brave deed. Not in potential, but in actuality. I'll take your question soon. Now there's reward. Now we're not referring to just reward for Abraham and Isaac. We're referring to the reward that will go on and on and on for their children, their grandchildren, until this very day. And that's why in our prayers, we're digging into that piggy bank a little bit, each and every single day. That reward that was coming for them, give me a little bit today. Make it a good day. Because remember what Grandpa Abraham did. The blessings are still there for us. And so it is for the benefit of the one being tested that God tests the individual. It's Abraham that benefited ultimately the most from it, although at the time he didn't know it. It's only after the challenge, after the test, that he and his descendants thereon forever and ever will be rewarded because Abraham listened to the voice of God. Yes, Barry?
The test is incomplete, not completed. How do you know it's not potential? I mean, why?
Because he went to the very end.
No, he didn't go to. If he would have killed Isaac, he would have gone to the very end. Why did God let him kill Isaac? That would be the exact proof.
I'm not the author of the story. I think that God was comfortable enough up until that last point that he's going to go all the way. And that brought it from potential to actuality. Even the bringing to that point, let us suppose, but at that moment there's reward given for that. Going that distance to bring him there, to bind him, to take the knife in his hand, to go that close. There's a lot of midrashim that will answer your question you asked me a little bit differently. I prefer to hold the questions to after because we're on recording and people can't hear the questions that are listening at home or that are on YouTube. So I will have a session after for those in the room. We'll take questions then. Number two comes from Maimonides. Maimonides explains that the main purpose and the main benefit of the binding of Isaac was for all the nations of the world to become aware of Abraham's righteousness and his willingness to go that distance for God. Why? Because they're going to hear all about this chosen people over and over, that you are going to bring morality and goodness to the world. Who are you? Why should we listen to you? Because of Zaidi Abraham. Even till this day, both the Muslim world has respect for Abraham, the Christian world has respect for Abraham. Abraham is that universal figure that the world has respect for. God wanted to demonstrate through the 10 tests of Abraham's faith, Abraham's total commitment to God. So when it says, now I know, the commentaries say, according to Maimonides, now the world will know. Therefore, the binding of Isaac is used, and we use that term, the term for tests in Hebrew is nes. Nes, like the same word like for a miracle, but nes really means a banner. So the binding of Isaac is a banner. It's a billboard for the world to understand who our father was and the lengths that our father was willing to go for God. That's number two. Number three comes from the Abarbanel, another classic of the Jewish commentaries, and he explains that it wasn't as much for the world to know about the greatness of Abraham, but for the Jewish people to know. We needed to know the greatness of our grandfather Abraham, so that we know what's in us, that we know that that greatness has been passed on from Abraham through all the generations into us, because we're going to need it. We're going to need that strength of faith. We're going to need that strength of Amunah to get through the difficult challenges and the difficult times of Jewish history. And finally, we have the Chassam Sofer. His commentary explains that the Jewish people throughout history would need the strength and the ability to perform acts of self-sacrifice, and that would only come if it was actualized by Abraham. If he went through it, as we mentioned, min hakoach el hapoel, that it was something that he carried through. Now that strength would be within us. So that when Hannah was asked for self-sacrifice, she was able to turn this switch on because that switch was always there. In the Torah portion of B'chukosai, it has this interesting verse, and it's also something that we do say in our prayers. And I want you to follow me. For those that know Hebrew, it might be a little bit easier, but in the English translation as well. Follow this. The verse says, V'zacharti, God's talking about the difficult times in Jewish history that's to come. So God's prophetically talking to Moses about our future. And it's not pleasant. The portion of B'chukosai has some really difficult prophecies about our future, and sadly and tragically, history has shown that they've all come true. And then when they were coming out of those words, now we're getting words of comfort, where God is saying, but I'm never, ever going to allow you to disappear. You're always going to survive. Whatever you're going to go through, there will always be a Jewish people so long as there's the world. And you're always going to come back to me. There's always going to be a relationship. I'm never divorcing you. Some of these words I'm putting myself into it. The words never divorce you actually comes from the books of the prophets, where the prophet says to God, the Jewish people feel that you've separated, and God says, Va'aye get Christus. Yeah, where's the divorce papers? Challenges. Ask the Jews, where's the divorce papers? I've never divorced you. I've hidden from you. And that's what the whole story of Purim is about. I've hidden from you. I never divorced you. Don't confuse hiding and divorce. It's a separation period, but I still love you very much. Here are the words that I want to focus on. When this happens, and you begin to return to me, V'zacharti, I will remember, says God, es Bryski Yaakov, the covenant that I made with Jacob. V'af es Bryski Yitzchak, and also the covenant that I made with Isaac. V'af es Bryski Avraham Eskar, and I will remember the covenant I made with Abraham. So what's God saying? All of these promises that I made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they're not promises to them individually. They're promises to all of you throughout history. You're going to come back, and I'm going to remember the relationships and the promises I had with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I'm going to embrace you. Powerful words. What do I want you to focus on? Listen again, in English. I will remember the covenant with Jacob, and the covenant with Isaac, and the covenant with Abraham I will remember. It's tough to pick up on. I'll try it one more time and see if anyone gets it. I will remember the covenant with Jacob, and also the covenant with Isaac, and I will remember the covenant with Abraham. There's 3 patriarchs mentioned here, right? There's 3 covenants mentioned here, but only twice is the word remember mentioned. He's going to remember the covenant with Jacob, and he's going to remember the covenant with Abraham. But by Isaac, he doesn't say, I'm going to remember. He just says, and the covenant with Isaac. He doesn't throw in the word zacharti.
What about V'amarti? Does he say it twice?
No, he says, V'af es Bryski Yitzchak. That's all he says, but doesn't use the word zachar. He uses the word zachar, which means to remember, right? Yiskar. He uses it when he talks about Jacob. He uses it when he talks about Abraham. He doesn't use it when he talks about Isaac. So those that are commentaries that look at every word of the Bible, they pick up on this, saying, if he just opened the verse, I will remember, and he said, I will remember the covenant with Jacob, the covenant with Isaac, the covenant with Abraham, I get it. He's just using it once. He doesn't have to repeat it every time. But because the author chose to throw the word memory in again by Abraham, and he uses it by Jacob, it begs the question, how come you were cheap on the word when it came to Isaac? Why does Isaac just get and, but he doesn't get and I will remember? You follow the question now? Yes. The answer, you ready? You say remember when you have to think back to something, right? I remember. It could be yesterday, it could be this morning, it could be a year ago, it could be 10 years ago, right? So when you use the word I remember, It's about something that's not in front of you right now. But if I was to say, I remember Jack was wearing a blue shirt, and I said it to you now, you would say, don't use the word I remember Jack was wearing a, say, I see Jack is wearing a blue shirt. Now, if I said I remember Jack was wearing a blue shirt last week, that makes sense. But you don't use the word remember by something that's right in front of me. So far, so good? So why doesn't God use the word remember when it comes to Isaac? The explanation is because the ashes of Isaac stand in front of God all the time. It never leaves. It's right there. So God cannot use the word remember when it comes to Isaac.
Say it again.
Because the ashes of Isaac stand in front of God at all times. It never leaves, so he doesn't have to remember Isaac. Isaac is right there.
Which ashes?
So that I was waiting for the question. The commentaries just get away with it because no one's in the class to raise their hand. They move on. What ashes? It didn't happen. Although Barry wants it to happen, it didn't happen. What ashes are we talking about? Again, the verse, I get the question. It says remember. It says remember. It clearly leaves out the word remember by Isaac. So the commentaries come along and say, because Isaac, God doesn't have to remember Isaac. Abraham happened thousands of years ago. Jacob happened thousands of years ago. The promises to Abraham happened thousands of years ago. The promise to Jacob happened thousands of years. But Isaac, no. Isaac is right there. God can't use the word I remember because Isaac's ashes are right there. I'll give you another example. The Talmud.
You're not going to give us that answer.
I'm going to give you the answer. The Talmud says, Mizbeach Mina Yodi. How do we know when we built the Holy Temple on the Temple Mount? How do we know where to put the altar? How do we know where the altar should go? And the Gemara goes ahead and says, Afroi shel Yitzchak ro shamunach ba'isei makam. They saw the ashes of Isaac laying on the place, and therefore they knew that's where the altar should go. Because the Temple Mount is where the binding of Isaac took place. The exact spot of where the altar was is where they found the ashes of Isaac. Again, ashes of Isaac. What's with these commentaries and these sages hung up about the ashes of Isaac? And the answer can really be found in the Rashi commentary on the story of the binding of Isaac, where he uses on the expression, take the ram and bring it as an offering tachas beno. Tachas beno can mean instead, in place of, but that tachas beno means literally as close to literal as that you can possibly be. That God will consider those ashes exactly as if they were Isaac's ashes. To the point that he keeps it in front of him because the preciousness of this story remained with God, that he never put it aside in a locker. He didn't put it in the storage room. He didn't say this goes to self-storage. It's staying right here. This is where it stays. So when he talks about remember, he can say, I remember Abraham and his greatness. I remember Jacob. But Isaac, the ashes are right here. And he blesses us every single day because those ashes are right there. And the same way figuratively, not that the ashes stayed for all the years there, but there was a marking on the place where the ashes of the ram actually once was. And that became the spot of where the altar in the Holy Temple was. So it's in these ashes that are before God that we call out to God and we pray to God each and every single day that when you look down upon us, see us through those lenses. The lenses of the ashes. What does that mean? The lenses of the commitment that these patriarchs of ours, of Abraham and Isaac, and the self-sacrifice and the complete giving of the self. And for that, bless their descendants. We may not be worthy, but bless us nevertheless, because of Zaydis, because of our bubbies. Thus, this story of the binding of Isaac is so paramount to any discussion that we can have about the chosen people. God does not challenge his chosen people for the fun of it. God tests us because he wants to make us stronger, because he wants to refine us, because he wants us to know our talents. He wants us to know our skills. He wants us to be able to follow through on the mission that he gave us thousands of years ago. We'll stop at this point. We'll continue next week on this continued subject of the chosen people and the challenges that we have faced. I'm going to take some questions in the room, but Jacob, you could say farewell to the people out there in Zoom land. Those of you out there, if you want to join us next week in person, we still have a few chairs left for you.